So welcome to our virtual 3 in 30s photography and place, and inspired by two of our special exhibitions on view at the museum along our, I'm going to give them their abbreviated titles, An American Born Hungary, and they're both on view at the museum. And Sarah, Dr. Kennel, was a curator, co-curator for the Long Arc exhibition. And I'm going to turn it over to Sarah now. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Lulan, and thank you everybody for coming today. I'm about to put my slideshow on. This is a 3 in 30. Normally it's 3 works of art in 30 minutes. When I did this live on Tuesday and we walked through the special exhibition galleries, I ended up talking about a few more works of art. So I'm just going to add in those 5. It's going to be 5 works of art total because there's some relationship between them. And hopefully we'll wrap this up as well in 30 minutes. Happy to answer questions at the end. So we'll leave a few minutes for that. You can just type them in the chat or raise your hand at the end. Okay, now I'm going to share my screen and we'll begin. Let's see how this goes. And I'd like to present my slideshow from the beginning. There we go. Okay, so I began this 3 in 30 with some of the earliest works of the history of photography and also in the exhibition Along Arc, Photography in the American South since 1845. And just to back up a little bit, the theme, photography in place, that we selected for these 3 in 30s really made a lot of sense because we have 3 presentations of photography on view right now at the museum. All of them address place in different ways. Along Arc, of course, looks at the American South and the history of photography there for the last 180 years. It's very focused on place. American Born Hungary not only looks at generations of photographers who were born in Hungary, but really follows them as they had to leave Hungary and emigrated to the United States, often stopping in Europe first, places like Paris, Germany, before going to the United States, where most of them settled in one of 3 major metropolitan areas, New York, Chicago, or Los Angeles. So that, of course, addresses place. And then our third presentation is on our 3rd floor photography gallery. And it's looking at 2 photographers from Richmond, or who are working in Richmond, Virginia now, Susan Worsham and Brian Palmer. And each of them are engaged in projects that explore the nexus of kind of place, family, and both death and rebirth. Susan Worsham is a Richmond native, and the project that is on view is kind of about her revisiting her childhood home in Richmond and the sort of stories and people around that. And then Brian Palmer, who was not originally from Richmond, followed his family roots to Virginia, and through the discovery of his great-grandfather, who was born enslaved and buried in a cemetery in Virginia, that sort of led him to do a project on Black cemeteries in Richmond. So that's the overview of all of the photography and place exhibitions we have on view right now. I'm now going to begin with this work, which is by a man named George Barnard. He was a photographer who's best known for his work during the American Civil War, and this is an example of that. But just a little background on Barnard. So he was born in 1819, and photography was introduced to the world in 1839. So he was a young man. He came from a farming family, but got involved with photography in the early 1840s. And so as I explained the other day, this is like startup culture, right? This is this new thing. You didn't necessarily have to have any particular background. You just had to be sort of entrepreneurial and somewhat intelligent and, be able to learn quickly. So he opened up a photography studio in the 1840s in New York, and he primarily at that time made portraits because that was the biggest demand. Those works of art in the 1840s were generally daguerreotypes, which are small objects on polished metal plates. You might have seen them. They're often in cases. They look like mirrors a little bit. We have some in the exhibition. But as photography changed, the move from making works on metal and glass to printing on paper happened in the 1850s. Cameras got faster, negatives got bigger, and there were more and more uses for photography. And he adapted along with the transformation in photography. And by the late 1850s, he had met Matthew Brady in Washington, D.C., and he began to work in his studio. And by the outbreak, or soon after the outbreak of the Civil War, he had become part of a group of photographers who were engaged by, in fact, Lincoln and the armies to document the impact and events of the Civil War. Now, the Civil War was a huge engine for photographic production in the United States. Not only were there many photographers who were documenting the war, they were kind of embedded primarily with Union armies. There were some photographers living in the South on the Confederate side in the very beginning of the war making photographs, but Union blockades of supplies meant that actually not a lot of photography materials could make it to southern states. So we definitely have kind of an army of photographers along with the Union Army. But also photography got a huge boon as well, because with all of these people going to war, the demand for photographs exploded. People wanted to have images of loved ones to take with them into battle, and people back home wanted to have images of those who were going off to war. The third way in which photography really transformed was it was being used for all these new purposes. There had been, of course, landscape and architectural photography, but not very much focused on war. In the 1850s and in the Crimean War, there was some photographic reproduction, but this was really the first major conflict that was thoroughly documented in photography. And we had photography being used in the war to do things like reproduce maps or make pictures of fortifications. It was used for military intelligence, and Barnard was part of that. By 1862, he was making those kinds of pictures. But by 1863, he was engaged by General William T. Sherman to follow that Army of the Mississippi through Sherman's march to the South and record the events and the sort of devastation of those armies as they traveled south. So Barnard traveled with Sherman's army, kind of documenting the aftermath of many of these battles and the really devastation of these places. But he didn't just make pictures right as these events were happening. Sometimes the armies were moving too fast. So at the end of the war, he actually went back to several places to photograph these areas that had remained devastated and emptied out. So, for example, this photograph made in Charleston, South Carolina, could have been made in 1865 or could have been made in 1866. We don't exactly know. So now I want to talk a little bit about what we're seeing itself. This is a record of the devastation of the beautiful city of Charleston, the ruins. But it's not just a kind of documentary photograph. It is also sort of an artistic construction, very carefully thought out. And this is one of the things that Barnard is so famous for. His works of photography were really also works of art that were drawing on contemporary aesthetics in drawing and in painting. And I think you can begin to see that if you look carefully at this photograph. I mean, first of all, it's very beautifully balanced. We have this building on the left that almost looks like a proscenium arch, you know, of a stage. There's a real interest in the reflection here, but also he's posed these two figures sitting on the rubble looking out. And we can say that maybe they were there for scale, and to a certain extent they were, but also they're there to give this photograph some narrative meaning. They are stand-ins for the viewer, and what they are doing is they are surveying and kind of coming to terms with the destruction that has happened. So this is kind of an elegiac, memorializing picture. And that speaks to the use of these photographs. These were not made so much to inform the armies as they were kind of a project of memory and reconciliation at the end of the war. Barnard, in fact, put together an album of 61 of these photographs in 1866 that was sold by subscription. And he wanted it done by Christmas, 1866. So it could be like a holiday gift. And at the time, it cost about $100, which is about $2,200 in today's money. So this was not an everyday purchase. These were not the widely reproduced small stereographs and carte de visites of war scenes that did circulate widely and were inexpensive. This was something that he sold primarily, to military officers, to generals, to people who had been involved in the war. And it was kind of both a documentation, but also in some ways, maybe in a strange way, also a kind of a justification for this terrible devastation. One thing that I think is interesting to note about this picture too, in terms of maybe a justification for the war, is to look at those two figures. There is a man with a pipe sitting on the kind of upper part of the rubble, but down below is a young boy, a young African American boy. And we know that Barnard was a staunch abolitionist. So his placement of these two figures, one Black person and one white person together in the same space, looking out on this devastation, may have been a way of kind of saying, this is why we had to do this. This is the reason for this devastation. There is a point here, which was ending slavery. Technically, Barnard is considered one of the most skilled artistic photographers of the Civil War. And there's a couple things that are really distinctive about his photographs, and I think come out even on the screen, although I do hope that you also have a chance to see them in person. We have a whole wall of Barnard's in the exhibition. One is that you might notice this is a very rich print. It's kind of got strong contrast, but also when we think of 19th century photographs, often we think of sepia toned, kind of warm brown. That is what happens to a lot of photographs over time, that they turn a kind of a warmer color. But Barnard used something called gold toning. It's actually made from gold, a gold chloride solution. And that helps increase the permanence of the image. But also when you use a lot of it, it really helps preserve that rich, almost purple color of the print. This is how a lot of these 19th century paper prints looked when they were first printed. So we have to kind of imagine sometimes that, photography that as we see it now in the 21st century is a little bit different than how it first appeared. So he was using gold toning, and gold then, as now, was expensive. So this was something that he was doing for a luxury publication. The other reason it was probably preserved so well is that most of these were actually bound in albums, and as they were closed, they did not get they didn't get exposure to light, environmental pollutants, and humidity as much as they might have had they been single sheets of paper on the wall or out. So the fact that it was in an album really helped preserve it. And the last thing I want to talk about is his technique in making these pictures. He was using a large format camera on a tripod, a box camera, and he had glass plates that were about 12 by 15 inches, so bigger than a normal size sheet of paper. And to make this photograph, he would have had assistants, and perhaps we're looking at those assistants in the picture. Perhaps those are people traveling with Barnard. Many 19th century photographers did have assistants because they had to travel with glass plates, which made the negatives, and lots of chemicals. And in order to make this picture, he would have taken his glass plate, he would have poured a solution on it called collodion, which is made from gun cotton and ether. It has a kind of consistency of warm maple syrup. So you had to swirl it on carefully and you wanted it to evenly coat the surface, otherwise those swirls would appear in the picture. And then you had to dip it into your light-sensitive chemical, silver nitrate, in the dark, because of course, if you did it in the light, it would immediately start to develop. Then you put it into a wooden plate holder, which protected it from light. And then you inserted that into the camera. You removed something in order to get the light exposure on the plate. You took off your lens cap if you had one even. You judged the exposure time by your experience and knowledge and observation of the light and weather conditions. And it might have been an exposure of 30 seconds or so. Could be very quick, could be longer, depends on the amount of light, and also depends on how good your lens is. And then you would put that plate holder back in the protective area so that it's covered up, and you would develop your plate, and then you would go back to your studio later and make prints from it. So it's a very elaborate process. So it takes a lot of skill. Now, one thing that Barnard did, and that helps us understand that he was not just making kind of pure documentation, but he was making artistic pictures, is he also did a bit of kind of Photoshop. Now, this is another picture by Barnard, and it is, of course, a photograph that is showing us these, I forgot the name of it, it's a French name, cheveux de frise, these kind of spiky things in front of the Rebel Works in Atlanta. But Barnard is also trying to create an atmosphere here, an atmosphere of drama and also beauty. One thing about photographic emulsions at this time was that they did not expose the landscape and the sky at the same rate, because the emulsions were not equally sensitive to all spectrums of the light. So if you wanted to get the detail that we see in this picture of the leaves, of those spikes, of the sandbags, then the sky would have been completely overexposed. It actually would have been like a heavy dark gray. A lot of 19th century photographers dealt with this by painting the skies out on their negatives. So they have kind of a blank sky. We can see that here. Doesn't look like there's a cloud in the sky. There might have been, but he painted it out. In this case, though, Barnard actually made two exposures. He exposed the sky and he exposed the landscape, and he printed them together to give it this. And we don't even know if it's the sky from that day. It could have been a different sky. There were photographers in the 19th century who would reuse the same beautiful cloudy sky for different pictures. But one thing you can see is you can kind of see how that tree on the right, the largest tree, the very top of it is kind of cut off flat like that. That's not a bad tree trimming job. That is probably just he's trying to figure out how to superimpose these two negatives. So there's a lot of handwork here. And I think the question is why. And part of it is he was demonstrating his artistic skill. But also we have to think about the function of these pictures. These were memorials, and they helped the nation come to terms with devastation. And they also established a trope of the South and the Southern landscape as a landscape of memory, of history, and of ruin. And I think we can see in these two pictures this attention to detail, the skies, the use of the kind of beautiful classical compositions, really is about creating a feeling, an experience. It's trying to capture not just the instrumental facts of what happened during the war, but the emotional toll and the devastation. So that actually leads me to my next photograph of the 3 in 30, which is by a contemporary artist, Sally Mann. Sally Mann is from Lexington, Virginia, and was born and bred Virginian, and a lot of her work has been about being a Southerner and the experience in the South. And while she began by photographing kind of her intimate life, her family, her children in Lexington, and then more broadly, the beautiful hills and landscapes of Virginia, in the 1990s, she began to think more critically about Southern history writ large. She was very interested in Civil War history. She had done a series right after this on Civil War battlefields. But here she's thinking about the South as a land that's both beautiful but also brutal, a land that has been the site of so much conflict of, brothers fighting brothers, but also a land that was built on the exploitation of enslaved Africans. And so she's making these landscapes and she's evoking this history in several ways in this picture, Scarred Tree. One is obviously the kind of metaphor, right? There's this incredible tree, it's the beauty of the South, but there's a scar on it. It is the scar, it is the violence, it is the scar of history. The second way in which she's thinking about past is inflecting the present, about the landscape as sort of being the repository of history and memory, is by actually going back and reviving 19th century photographic techniques. So to make this photograph, she used essentially the same negative process that Barnard did. She's working with a glass plate negative. She's pouring collodion on it. She's dipping it into chemicals, and she's exposing it in a 19th century camera with a 19th century lens. And in fact, you can kind of see on the upper sides, these little silhouettes, it's kind of curved. That is a deliberate choice to use a lens that's a little bit too small for the camera, and it creates this beautiful kind of quiet silhouette shape. And then she's not using the exact same printing technique as Barnard did. He made what was called albumin prints. They're prints made with their papers coated with albumin, which is an egg white substance, and coated then with a silver salt. She's using 20th century black and white paper, gelatin silver paper, but she is actually then toning those prints in tea, in Lipton tea, to give it this kind of warm quality. So just as Barnard toned his in gold chloride to preserve that intensity, she's toning hers in tea to give it a kind of look of the 19th century. So we see here two photographers one who is establishing a trope of the South as the land itself as the repository for history and memory, and kind of using photographs not just as information, but as to create an emotional experience. And then a 20th century photographer and 21st century looking back at that history and reclaiming it for herself. And just as an aside, Sally Mann is speaking at the museum tonight. If you have tickets and you're here, it's going to be fabulous. If you don't have tickets, it is sold out, but we are live streaming it. And you can get that link on our website. And she is a terrific spinner of stories, and it's going to be a great event. So I hope that you will hop online again tonight at 6:30 if you have a chance. Now, one of the things that I just learned in the run of this exhibition, and I've known this picture and Sally Mann's work for a long time, is that she was traveling with another photographer when she made this, a photographer whose work is very different. So it's kind of fun to think about them photographing together, because this work this work by this photographer who's traveling with Sally Mann, Richard Mizrak, is also up right now in a long arc, and this also deals with photography in place. So Richard Mizrak he's best known as a landscape photographer in the California and the West, but he received a commission from the High Museum of Art to picture the South. This was part of an ongoing commissioning initiative that the High Museum established to tap sort of well-known photographers, but maybe who had never been to the South, maybe who had, to make pictures about the South. And in fact, Sally Mann was one of the very first photographers who was selected to picture the South. So I think Richard contacted her, they knew each other, and they photographed together for a while in Virginia before he continued his trip down to Louisiana. His project is very different. It is looking at this pipeline, these areas in Louisiana, and parts of Mississippi that have been utterly transformed by petrochemicals. And really, we can see here this long pipeline here, and this beautiful picture. It's about 6 feet long, beautiful color, but it's also very unsettling because that is not a natural color. So he's indicating the kind of transformation of our natural world through, these through industry. And this project was part of a larger project that he ended up publishing under the title Cancer Alley, because of course it is really among these areas where the most toxic chemicals were leached into the soil or directly deposited into the waters that created health hazards that spiked cancer rates in the communities along these pipelines, and many of whom were sort of the most disenfranchised communities. So we see Sally Mann kind of looking at the violence of the past that exists within the Southern landscape, and Richard Misrak is thinking about a different kind of violence that has been enacted on the landscape. We're almost done. I have one more photograph that I want to talk about, and that is in the show American Born Hungary. So imagine you've walked out of a long arc. If you've seen the shows, one flows into the other. And now we enter a very different world, a world of artists who are born in one country, many of whom sort of experienced the massive social transformations in Hungary during World War I, the rise of fascism, inflation. There was a huge jump in anti-Semitism, which prompted a lot of photographers like André Kertész to leave. André Kertész first goes to Paris, and he's an unknown quantity there, but he eventually finds his way and becomes sort of the one of the most well-known photographers working in Paris in the 1920s. And this is Paris in the 1920s, so everybody's hanging out at cafes and drinking, and there are lots of other Hungarian expats. And he really kind of finds himself as a photographer in Paris. He publishes work, he exhibits work, he is friends with other avant-garde artists. He photographs the studio of Mondrian, of many other artists. However, in the 1930s, things begin to change in Paris as well. There's that sort of impact of the Great Depression is really hitting Europe, rising anti-Semitism, the fear of the war really coming to Europe prompted Kertész and many others in the late 30s to leave, who were Jewish, to leave France and come to the United States. So he comes to the United States in 1936, and he very clearly has a hard time finding his footing. Part of it is it's the second major transformation he's had to make to pick up and start a new life. When he moved to Paris, he was a young man and he had other friends. He moves to New York. It's much harder to establish a footing. He tries to get his pictures published in Life magazine. He was a frequent publisher in the avant-garde magazines in Paris and in Europe, but he had a hard time getting anybody to understand his pictures, which were sort of not traditional journalistic photographs, but much more poetic. And in fact, he would spend about 20 years being a house photographer, sort of a staff photographer for House and Garden, photographing boring interiors until he was rediscovered in the 1960s. So he has this very difficult period. And this is one of the pictures he makes a year after coming to New York. And, so many photographers, when they come to New York, this is the period of the skyscrapers, and they are enthralled and fascinated with these behemoths that represent American modernity and an industry and power. But this picture is a very poignant one, and I see it as a self-portrait. And in fact, Kertész wrote about this picture later. He said, "I was very touched by the little cloud against the skyscraper, because it didn't know which way to go." And so we can see here how he's injecting a very poetic and personal experience into this very distinctive picture of New York, a picture that's not about sort of the power of, money and industry and architecture, but that is about loneliness and isolation and poignancy. And it really is a way, it's a picture of place that's also a self-portrait. So I hope that these pictures have given you a little bit of a taste of what's on view at the museum.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sarah, and thanks everyone for joining us. And we'll see everyone next month.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.